transnational organised criminal groups. This is not local people involved in subsistence hunting, or this is not driven locally, this is driven internationally. It is driven by transnational organised criminal groups who are very well organised, very savvy. When you read the report, you'll see they're very clever at avoiding measures that are put in place by the international community to counter this. One thing's done, so they go another way. Something else is done, they go another way. And it shows the complexity of trying to deal with this. And these groups are basically corrupting people across the entire illegal supply chain. They are disrupting local communities, and that's why there's a great human toll to this, as well as the toll on the individual animals, their habitats, the ecosystems.
I just want to give you a bit of an overview of the work that I've done recently for the Global Initiative, some of the research work that has gone into these reports, and some of the trends that it's highlighted. I think that we are in a situation where, when it comes to wildlife trafficking, when it comes to rhino poaching, we need to start confronting some fairly unpalatable truths. And the challenges that we all face, and I mean this in a global sense, because it's not something that can be tackled by range states alone, is an enormous one. Despite the best efforts of law enforcement officials, in many cases, government conservation agencies, prosecutors, this remains a constantly growing threat. And there are a number of people, I've seen some in the room here, people who have really dedicated their lives to this, from the prosecuting authorities, from customs, from the South African Revenue Service, from some of the neighbouring states' conservationists. But for me, this is symptomatic of much bigger problems within society and across the illicit supply chain, the various countries that are affected. And what we're dealing with is an issue of serious socioeconomic issues. We're dealing with, for instance, in South Africa, violent crime rates that are on the rise. We're dealing with corruption, which is rife across that illicit supply chain. It's something that unfortunately is a challenge to almost every single one of those countries. And the socioeconomic disparities that exist in those countries, which make for a fertile breeding ground for poaching and wildlife trafficking. You also have your international agencies, Interpol, CITES, we're obviously all here at the COP17, who are reliant on country officers to be able to conduct their work, who are reliant on local legislation being implemented and action being taken. And the sad reality is that in many cases, we look particularly at countries like Vietnam, countries like Laos, there has been an unwillingness or an inability to tackle the wildlife trafficking syndicates that are based there. I often say to people, if you walk out of this room, if you walk into the street outside and you ask someone to name an international drug kingpin, almost anyone will immediately think of Pablo Escobar or Chapo Guzman. The names are common, they've become part of popular culture. I'm sure there are people here binge watching Netflix's latest series, Narcos. But the names of the wildlife traffickers, for the most part, remain in the shadows. Very few have ever really been identified. Very few have been exposed. People like, for instance, Vishay Keersevang, who's someone I wrote about some years ago, and have been writing about since 2011. And this is a man who was at the head of quite a ruthless wildlife trafficking network, the Keersevang network, to the extent that the US State Department at one stage offered a $1 million reward, effectively a bounty, for information leading to the dismantling of that network. And despite that, he continues to be in business. Very little has come of that reward. There was an initial fanfare that's dissipated. Other individuals like Chu Dang Kwa, also known here locally as Michael Chu, he's been the subject, and I'll come back to him later, he's been the subject of extensive coverage in Vietnam. But that coverage has centered not on the activities that he's been linked to, it's centered on an affair that he's had with a pop star and an actress. To give you a bit of an overview of the problem, and I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with some of these numbers, but for those of you not, more than 6,000 rhinos have been lost in Africa since over the last decade. 1,377 last year. Namibia recently changed or updated their poaching figures from 90 to 125. Estimated about 25,000 rhino left in Africa today, 19,600 to 21,000 white rhino, 5,500 black rhino. And in 2015, 1,342 rhino were killed across 7 African states. South Africa has been very much the focus of this. It's home to 79% of the continent's last rhinos. And the poaching crisis here, which really kicked off in 2008, was something that very few people could predict or expect. And the onslaught has been astonishing, and the speed of that onslaught has been astonishing. South Africa has roughly 18,000 white rhino, 1,800 black rhino, 5,500 roughly have been killed since January 2006 and by April of this year. That equates to about 22 times the number of rhinos that were lost in South Africa in the preceding 25 years. There's a recent academic paper that was published, which suggests that if poaching rates continue at current levels, or the levels that were experienced in 2013 when 598 rhinos were killed, the Kruger National Park's white rhino population will plummet to between 2,879 and 3,263 individuals by 2018. Obviously, poaching levels are much higher, although I'll come to some successes in Kruger soon. The Kruger itself is the eye of the storm. And I think for many people it's hard to comprehend the size of the place. Even if you drive along the roads that crisscross the park, past the waterholes teeming with wildlife, you still don't get a sense of how big that place is. And what some of the park's officials done, what I've done as myself, is you lift off in a helicopter and you climb and you climb and you climb until you can see the horizon in the distance, and the carcass below you disappears and the people around it disappear. And there are no witnesses. There's no real evidence except the physical evidence that can be picked up there. The park itself, 19,485 square kilometers, the size of Israel or Wales. And it's effectively policed by 400 field rangers, 22 section rangers, 15 special rangers. There is a company of soldiers. There have been severe problems there in terms of discipline, in terms of their ability to actually do the job that they have been tasked with. This is now the soldiers that were deployed there. So ultimately it comes down to the field rangers. And it's a very tiny force, and you would only be able to cover, I think the estimates were around 50, one ranger for every 50 square kilometers, if they work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Kruger has lost 3,189 rhinos, and actually more now in the past decade since I did these slides. But it is home to the most significant population of rhinos in South Africa. And a great deal has been said about the war on poaching. And it's an easy term that is bandied about, often by officials, and used, in my view, often without thought. This is a war of attrition, if you do want to see it as a war. But I think it is quite problematic in the sense that it makes it very much an us and them situation. It's rangers on the one side, poachers on the other. It simplifies the problem that we face far too extensively. But to give you an idea of the problem within Kruger, you're looking at around 7,500 poachers estimated, and that's apparently a conservative estimate, entering the park in 2015. That's a 43% increase in activity on the previous year. Last year there were 137 armed contact shootouts between poachers and rangers, compared to 111 in 2014. And 80% of the activity in recent years have been concentrated on the south of the park, which is also the site of the intensive protection zone where the bulk of the rhinos populations are clustered. The bulk of the incursions these days are coming from South Africa, not across the border from Mozambique, although many of the poaching gangs and people involved remain Mozambican nationals. And there's an appalling human cost to all of this. There's a cost to rangers who work in long hours, who are strung out, who are overstressed, who are underpaid. soldiers who've been killed. At least 7 soldiers have died in the park, many of them in 2 tragic accidents. There are 2 field rangers and policemen who were killed, and around 150 to 200 suspected poachers, many of them breadwinners from the communities that they originated from. And there's an unanswerable question that gets asked often if I travel to parts of Mozambique where the so-called poaching villages are. Last year I met a father there whose son had been shot and killed in Kruger. And the question that he asked me is, why is an animal's life worth more than my son's? The answer back from rangers would be, well, what was your son doing in a national park with a weapon? But it's still something that is at the core of much of this. You have people who are being buried in communities who are being buried as heroes. These are people who went out to try and bring back money into those communities, who are people that are looked up to in those communities because of the money that they're bringing back, the local economies that are springing up off the back of poaching. So that remains a very real challenge. The poachers themselves, from some research that's been done, some of the stuff that we've looked at, roughly 5 to 15 groups of poachers in the Kruger National Park at any given time. You have shooters earning quite a wide variety of fees. Some unpublished sandbox data, which is gathered from interrogations, suggests anything from $2,000 up to $20,000 for a kill. And interestingly, taking a lead from some of the transnational syndicates and the buyers, poaching networks have started charging per kilogram for the horn that is being sold. Figures of upwards of $5,000 a kilogram, but it does vary quite widely. CZ550 hunting rifles, in many ways because they're cheap and they're widely available, have become the weapons of choice for poachers. 6 years ago, when I began looking at this, silencers were a rarity. Today, silencers are found on most weapons that are seized within national parks and seized in neighboring countries. South Africa, with the exception of 2 provinces, has very few sort of regulations or restrictions relating to silencers. Silencers are, however, banned in countries like Zimbabwe. And that's the weapon that's being held there. That was a photograph taken in Zimbabwe some years ago. That was one of the early rifles that had been seized with a fairly crudely made, homemade silencer attached to it. Now we're beginning to see far more sophisticated sound suppressors, which dampen rather than kill the sound of the shot. The silencer on the left there is a Swedish manufactured silencer, which was also found in Zimbabwe. There's also, sustaining all of this, a steady trade in weapons that have been stolen in other crimes, weapons from government stockpiles, and also in the last few years, a thriving trade in weapons rentals. Individuals who rent out weapons to poachers and make them available and then rent them out to the next gang. In part, in the case of Kruger, because there have been quite a number of successes in seizing large quantities of weapons, and there have been shortfalls in weapon supply to poachers in the recent past. There's been high demand for weapons. Now, if you look at the situation in South Africa, rhino poaching is on paper a priority crime. While broader wildlife crime is not a priority at this juncture, or not designated a priority crime at this juncture. But the reality is, and people often say, we need more political will. There isn't enough political will. There are far greater priorities in all of these countries, in every single one of the countries that has to deal with this. And poaching is fairly low down the food chain. And I don't think that we might get increased political will, but I don't think we'll necessarily get the political will that we all want. If you look at the challenges in South Africa, for instance, you have rising levels of violent crime. You've got a stagnant economy, widespread unemployment, a schooling system that is in trouble, increasing numbers of service delivery protests. There's a lack of housing, lack of basic services. There's entrenched corruption. And many of our agencies have been eroded over the years by political interference, by maladministration, some of the police, some of the intelligence agencies, which makes the jobs of the people who are the dedicated prosecutors, the dedicated investigators, and the people who are really giving their all to this, incredibly difficult. Another thing to take into account is that environmental agencies, the Department of Environmental Affairs here and in other places, which have been the lead agencies in the struggle for so long, are often have some of the smallest budgets in government. The Department of Environmental Affairs here, for instance, was allocated a budget of around 5.9 billion rand in 2015 and 16. And that's less than 1% of the national government total. By comparison, the defence and public safety budget is 172 billion. And the role of the DEA is beginning to change here, and I think we've seen since the last COP in Bangkok a slow move to putting increasing pressure on law enforcement agencies to take the lead in all of this. The DEA here is not an agency that is tasked with gathering intelligence. It's not an agency that is equipped to tackle transnational organised crime syndicates and activities. And that's true for most environmental agencies. If we look at arrests in South Africa, we've had more than 1,700 suspected poachers and rhino horn smugglers arrested since 2010. The figures have increased steadily. The numbers in red obviously are the totals. Kruger is marked in blue, and the green is the rest of South Africa. But while those arrests are taking place, they often don't translate directly into convictions. And the National Prosecuting Authority, like a number of prosecuting authorities around the world, I believe in the US, this is also true of some of the agencies there, often lay claim to conviction rates of 80% or 90% when it comes to key crimes. What is crucial there is the definition of how that is defined. And the NPA, borrowing from a US definition, looks at the percentage of cases that were finalized with a guilty verdict divided by the number of cases finalized with the verdict. So effectively what you're often ending up with is a case, let's say we have 10 poachers arrested, you get 8 poachers convicted, you have an 80% conviction rate. What that doesn't take into account, and what this slide shows in relation to Kruger National Park, is the number of cases that simply never make it to court. 928 cases reported between January and December 2015. Some of those cases had rolled over from the previous year. 61 were in court, 29 resulted in convictions. 405 were listed as undetected, which essentially means that there wasn't sufficient evidence to pursue, get a conviction. None were marked as withdrawn, and then 433 were kicked back to investigators for further investigation. And often prosecutors have the unenviable task of going through dockets that just simply haven't been made case ready, that have to be sent back, in some cases sent back repeatedly for further investigation. Another simple aspect as well is that rhino poaching is not recorded on as a crime on the police's crime administration system. And what that could certainly do is, at the moment, the crimes are reported as legal possession of firearms, trespassing. Such if there was a change, and that will be spoken about shortly, would at least make the police far more accountable in the report backs that they give on their successes in rhino poaching. It would certainly also make that part of the crime figures, the annual crime figures, which are reported. We're now actually getting quarterly crime reports. But the challenges, and these are some of the ones that we've identified in the room, in the reports. The wrong people in the room. All too often you go to conferences, you go to meetings, and the people talking about organised crime, talking about transnational syndicates, are conservationists or government officials in environmental departments. The police agencies are often absent from those meetings, and this is a global problem. You need the right people to be in that room. You need the people that can actually make a difference in that room. You have agreements being signed between environmental agencies, between governments on law enforcement. But those agreements are being signed by environmental ministries, often the most junior ministries, not by safety and security or policing departments. The silo effect. You have fragmentation of information. People policing their own backyard, not sharing information internationally. And this certainly has been a problem with relations between Vietnam and South Africa, for instance, where law enforcement agreements have been signed, but there's been very little information sharing coming back from Vietnam. There's some pressure on Vietnam currently to report back on hunting trophies from pseudo-hunts because they haven't accounted for that. And there's been very little information. Samples of rhino horn that were sent back to South Africa for testing went missing. Attempts by South African officials to bring samples back were not granted by the Vietnamese authorities. Crime intelligence, which is key. That should be the ultimate, one of the key agencies dealing with police crime intelligence. And in South Africa, we've had years of maladministration, corruption, political infighting. The police crime intelligence units become a political tool in many cases. It's largely leaderless. Its former head, Richard Bluely, for instance, is standing trial on a variety of charges ranging from murder, kidnapping, corruption, and fraud. The acting head who replaced him was placed on special leave after consistently lying about his school qualifications. Secret funds have been plundered. It's a mess. And you also have crime intelligence people who've been implicated in the rhino horn trade, people who've been arrested in connection with that. Corruption we've spoken about quite extensively. Corruption is key, and I think it's refreshing to see that corruption is on the agenda of CITES this year. And I think in many ways that is probably one of the greatest challenges to dealing with this. And sadly, in so many countries, it remains a fairly intractable problem. Language barriers, fairly simple thing, but cases are being thrown out of court in South Africa because interpreters are not available. Interpreters can't be found. Chinese, Vietnamese, Thai interpreters in many cases are too afraid to become involved in organized crime cases. In some cases, there's been infiltration by criminal networks using people that they've appointed as interpreters. But more than that, when it comes to police investigations, if you're investigating transnational syndicates from other countries, for argument's sake, China, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and you don't have police who can speak the language, and you don't have a way of interrogating suspects, and you've got as many wiretaps as you want up, and it takes you months to get transcripts of those wiretaps, those investigations are going to go nowhere. Illicit financial flows, again, so little work has been done on that. It's picking up, it's gathering speed. In South Africa, there's been some dramatic changes around that. There's a major focus now on illicit financial flows. The old thing of following the money, which cannot be understated. And then I think the biggest challenge here for law enforcement is that these are networks without borders. These are criminal networks that operate easily across international boundaries. They operate easily across multiple legal jurisdictions. They're not bound to the same strictures that law enforcement authorities are bound to. And inevitably, they 10, 12 steps ahead of law enforcement. And unless you can impact on the illicit supply chain at every step, from Africa through into Europe, through into Asia, from the US out into Asia, unless you can interdict it at that level, is you can disrupt that at every level along that chain, you're again on a hiding to nothing. And what that leads to is what we often see around here, where you have low-level couriers, low-level poachers being arrested and convicted. And the middlemen and the so-called kingpins remain largely untouchable. Just very briefly, one of the more interesting cases, obviously many of you have probably heard the term pseudo-hunting, looking at sham hunts of white rhino, people using South Africa's hunting regulations to obtain trophies and then smuggling those out for black market consumption. And while the problem has been brought to a large part under control and is nowhere near the levels that were experienced in 2012, 13, 14 and earlier, there are indications. I think what this does is it demonstrates the ingenuity and the ruthlessness of the criminal networks involved. They are constantly evolving. They're constantly looking for new outlets to obtain their product. The sham hunts between 2010 and 2011 became so widespread that trafficking networks in Thailand, Vietnam came to dominate the hunting of rhino in South Africa. And there's, according to some of the figures here, as many as 40 hunts were conducted by Vietnamese nationals 400 hunts were conducted by Vietnamese nationals between 2003 and 2012, costing them around $22 million US. But the rewards were so much greater. If you look at the prices that were available at the time, where rhino horn was selling per kilogram at anything between 40 and 65,000 US dollars a kilogram. There's some research now that those prices have come down quite significantly. But once the South Africans cracked down on the Vietnamese and Thai pseudo hunters, the market shifted to former Eastern European countries, and the Czech Republic found itself as an unlikely nexus for pseudo hunting activity. That is extended to other countries like the Slovak Republic, Poland, the Ukraine, and there's some speculation about China. There's been, as you can see from the slide here, there has been quite a significant increase in hunters from China or from China in particular, coming to Africa in 2014 and 15. The Czech connection, this will be discussed at another side event next week. I think Pavla Rehova's here, she'll deal with some of that. But just to take you through, this was one of the big seizures that took place there, where treated game trophies were intercepted. These were being rerouted from the Czech Republic to Vietnam. That was one of the first consignments of horns that were intercepted. 60 Czech citizens applied for hunting permits between 2008 and 2014. And many of those were linked to pseudo hunting activity. In one instance, horns were found which were being smuggled out in machine parts that had been manufactured, again demonstrating the ingenuity, constantly finding new ways of trafficking horn. There have been cases, for instance, in the Czech Republic where tiger skeletons have been smuggled out in hi-fi speakers. Another challenge, I think, and it's been a perennial challenge here, the role of the Vietnamese embassy has been well documented in the Vietnamese embassy in South Africa, and the links to rhino horn trafficking a number of years ago have been very well documented. What has been less well documented is the possible resurgent role of North Korea and North Korean diplomats. And this came to light when this individual, Pak Chol Jun, and a Taekwondo master were arrested in Mozambique last year with 4.5 kilograms of rhino horn and 100,000 US dollars in cash in their vehicle. And for diplomats like these, the privileges that they enjoy in terms of the Vienna Convention are an opportunity to commit, in some ways, the perfect crime. And diplomatic bags are abused, be they consignments, be they containers, be they small packages, to ship out quantities of rhino horn and other contraband. One of the problems here is the support that police have when they try and investigate and intercept these sorts of consignments, is that they need the political support to do their work. Police are often told when diplomats are involved simply to leave it alone, to back off. Many of the cases never make it to court. And yet the convention actually allows for containers, for diplomatic bags to be opened or detained in circumstances where there is significant evidence that they have been used for criminal activity. The North Korean diplomats that were involved in this, we attempted to get some comment from them while we were writing the report. They did react quite badly. They belted us with stones at one point, and then later wrote a letter rejecting the claims in the report, claiming that they were fabricated and made up, and criticized what they described as dirty articles, criticizing the supreme leader. But there's a long history of this, dating back to the 1980s. We looked at as many cases as we could find of diplomats involved in smuggling rhino horn or ivory. And of the 29 cases that we identified over a period of 30 years, 16 of those involved North Korean diplomats. And much of that has to do with the fact that North Korean embassies are required to raise funding. They're one way to bring in foreign currency. And there have been numerous cases where North Korean embassies have been implicated in smuggling contraband ranging from counterfeit money to tobacco to drugs to diamonds. In a Zimbabwean context, we also have, Zimbabwe is now having a significant increase in poaching, 51 rhinos killed last year. And one of the more disturbing threads of that is, and for years it's been rumoured, but there are now indications that sort of point to some hard evidence of the involvement of the country's central intelligence organisation in supplying weapons to poachers, in facilitating rhino horn being smuggled out of the country. This particular individual, Dumisani Moyo, who's wanted by Interpol, is one of the country's most notorious poachers and has links to the CIO. There's also the case of a Central Intelligence Organisation officer who was arrested, who should be facing trial, who is accused of supplying weapons to poachers. Those weapons were also used in one incident to kill 2 police officers. And you have this confluence of licit and illicit activities. And one of the individuals whose name is featured for several years now is Chu Dang Kwa, who I spoke about earlier, Michael Chu, who is someone who's been in the headlines of late in Vietnam, mainly for his affair with a Vietnamese supermodel turned pop star, and that's become sort of grist for the country's gutter press. The reports themselves describe him often as a diamond tycoon, a mysterious character who made his money in South Africa, where he specialized in rhino horns, ivory and diamonds. He was arrested in South Africa in connection with 5 rhino horns. He was convicted at one stage, and he subsequently left the country after paying a fine. But Chu also registered a company called DKC Trading, which owns a 924-hectare farm in South Africa's northwest province. And it's a farm where rhinos have been farmed, where tigers have been farmed, and where tigers have been sold, most particularly to a new safari park on Phu Quoc Island off the coast of Vietnam, Vinh Pearl Safari Park. There were also attempts to obtain 100 rhinos to sell to that particular zoo. And while all those transactions on paper met all the requirements, there is concern of this confluence of licit and illicit activity where people like Chu, people involved in his network, people who run that particular farm, have repeatedly been implicated in rhino poaching or smuggling rhino horn. This is one particular case of 2 individuals who've been closely linked to that farm, Chu Duc Gulet and Nguyen Dang Can. Chu Duc Gulet was one of the most prolific of the Vietnamese pseudo-hunters in South Africa, shooting 4 rhinos between 2009 and 2011 in various hunts. He was arrested in a police operation called Operation Whisper, and a large number of rhino horns were found in the house that he was using, a dozen rhino horns, some of them buried in the back garden, and he was subsequently convicted. The person on the right, Nguyen Dang Can, was released after entering a plea deal with prosecutors. But some of the other activities this highlights, and you have simply from rhino poaching, or pseudo-hunting of rhinos and activities of farm, stemming into other activity. And tigers is one aspect that we've highlighted in this report, where tigers in South Africa have very few protections because they are exotic species. In fact, in many cases, there's very little idea of how many tigers there are in the country. And with rare exceptions, there are very few controls over tiger hunts. This photograph was posted on Facebook some time ago posted in 2015. It's unclear exactly when that photo was taken. But that's one of the individuals on the farm, Van Tan Chu, who calls himself Beckham, posing, the man on the right, posing with a tiger that had been shot. You probably can't really see it very closely, but in the background are the tiger cages on Voi Lodge, so it's within sight of those tiger cages. Another photograph that emerged of one of the Voi Lodge employees sticking a rifle through there and taunting some of the animals. Those are some of the tiger facilities. And DKC Trading has been involved in a large degree of a large number of transactions, shipping 20 tigers, 12 monkeys, numerous birds, caracal hyenas to Vinh Pearl Safari Park. So just in conclusion, is that I think what we need to look at, and I think this is what requires almost a radical rethink of current law enforcement strategies, and Niall will speak to that, is that you have networks that are ruthlessly efficient. They're imaginative, they're endlessly adaptive, and they are free of the strictures that law enforcement authorities face. And this is something that has to be tackled on a global scale. It can't be done in isolation by range states. They simply don't have the resources or the support to do that. And I think it's also important to look at the fact that your key consumer countries like Vietnam, like Laos, like China, are key to any possible solutions. Without them, in many ways, that struggle is lost. And I'll leave it there and hand over to Lyle. Thank you very much.
Anti-poaching efforts alone will never solve the problem of wildlife trafficking. And to support me, I would like to quote the man in charge of arguably the biggest anti-poaching project in the world. And if you know General Uester, and you engage him at meetings and forums, one of the first things he'll say is that we will not win the war inside, or the battle combated inside the park successfully. So this is what you see in a lot of presentations, how it's gone up and the issue. And the public out there gets to see this on a weekly basis. And it draws a lot of emotion from people. But we must be realistic. We must understand the security challenges and environment that this is taking place in. I want you to, for a second, imagine you're the person in charge of the South African Police Service. And we come to him or her, and this is the issue. And you have to deal with issues like this. The last 5 years, 4,840 rhinos were poached in South Africa. But we've also had 82,000 murder cases reported, 296,000 sexual assault cases, drug-related crime, illegal possession of firearms, stock theft, commercial crime, over almost 500,000. So where will this deal be dealt with from a policing priority? And the one thing when it comes to organized crime and crime prevention, the one thing all securocrats will jump up and talk about is resources. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. Then we have other issues in South Africa, like most developing countries in Africa and in the rest of the world. We have issues with poverty and unemployment. That feeds into organized crime activities. We have issues with border management, porous borders, which is throughout the board. Then I would like to talk about this because this is very important, especially from a national security point of view. Corruption provides that environment for organized crime to take place. You cannot prevent, combat, investigate, prosecute organized crime if you do not look at the corrupt angle. Firstly, we've identified 3 levels taking place in South Africa. The first one is the detection level. That's your ranger looking the other way when he catches a poacher. Your police official at a border post letting the car through. He's not doing his job and he's getting paid to look the other way. Then they evolve. Corrupt officials evolve like organized criminal crime syndicates evolve. They become cleverer, they become businessmen. So what do? They start facilitating because they can make more money. And as soon as they start facilitating and they're starting to take a bigger part of the pie, they start taking the whole pie because now I have the authority. I'm in charge, I have an executive power to run the illicit part. So something you must keep in mind when you go, I want to prevent transnational organized crime, including wildlife trafficking. This is very important to look at which angles. Then, when we got together and developed the strategy, another issue we have is this publication is of Julian. It focuses on rhino. But in South Africa, it's not just about rhino. It's about the entire wildlife trafficking issue with all species. It includes abalone, a very big issue for us, a lot of links to organized crime, especially from Southeast Asia. Lion and tiger bones, including pangolin, ivory, cycads, reptiles, exotic birds, timber, etc., etc., etc. Okay. So keep all of these aspects in the back of your mind when we get to what we are planning. So, the proliferation of transnational organized crime since the 1990s. When African countries in the 1990s opened a lot of their borders for trade and movement of people, the government said, let's enable this from taking place. And only afterwards said, let's secure this process. So in many senses, we're playing catch-up. So it was in this environment that wildlife trafficking just slotted in, because it's a resource that has very little risk but immense reward. One of the big mistakes people make, and especially from a bureaucratic point of view, is to see these people as criminals. They're not criminals, they're businessmen. Whatever can I sell, make the biggest reward and the least risk to get out of business. And that's where wildlife trafficking started in. I can make a lot more money selling horns in Asia, and if I get caught, punishments are smaller compared to, for example, drug trafficking. If you go back to the corruption slide, I want to trade in horn. I already have my corrupt official at the border post helping my vehicles go through for vehicle smuggling. I just put the horn in the car and I make 3-4 times than I make just smuggling vehicles. Okay. Then when I got involved in the Rhino project 2-3 years ago, coming from an organised crime background from in the state, this is one of the first things I saw, and very much because who was in control and who was in charge in preventing and combating, it was very much conservation. So they developed this model to say, let's understand the syndicates. I think this is one of the first mistakes we made. Because let's look at resource allocation and attention. This has got the biggest part. It's got the biggest part. And who's mostly involved here? Conservation. It's wildlife crime. So as we try to understand, and people involved in this project start understanding this phenomenon, they started complicating it. Okay, that guy, this guy, and yes, organised crime is a complicated activity. It's very complex. But if you look at transnational organised crime, this is what you must see. The flow. The flow. Just like you are selling goods internationally, the flow. So this is what when we started getting involved from a national security point of view, strategically at law enforcement, we went back to the drawing board and said, hold on, this is what you must be looking at. So this is violent wildlife chain. You cannot look at poaching, facilitation, smuggling, the illicit market, the end user, without looking at the corruption angle, without looking at how the proceeds are being laundered, and without, there's always links to other forms of organised crime. Drugs, prostitution, all forms. So this is what we must do. The amount of resources and attention that you put on that level, you must put throughout the board. And at the moment, as Julian said, the majority of our resources and attention is on poaching, by far. And then again, especially for people in the conservation environment, that's new to the issue of organised crime. You don't catch a poacher and 3 weeks later you have arrested the syndicate leader 3 countries away and prosecuted him. Some of the most sophisticated law enforcement entities in the world from certain countries took years and years, and we're talking about resources that a country like South Africa doesn't have, to catch organised criminals countries away. So it's sophisticated, it's difficult. And why? Very simple. These people are protected by borders, corrupt officials, they have the best lawyers, they have the best accountants, etc., etc. Yeah. So as the President said in his opening address yesterday, we have now officially, and I was very glad to see him representing us in that format, that now we're officially saying that this is an issue of national security, like other forms of transnational organised crime in our country. Why? Firstly, it's a human and environmental issue as a threat. People's lives are in danger because of this, not just the fauna and flora. Secondly, it has a very severe impact on our state security in South Africa. It's corrupting the state institutions, state processes, our border management processes. The intensity and impact, like we see the rhino stats, but it's so much more. Billions and billions of rands of wildlife, and proceeds of that wildlife is being trafficked out of the country. Okay. And then lastly, not something that any government in the world can do very easily, but we have to be honest with ourselves and say, we approached this incorrectly, like all the countries in the world did. And why do I say that? If you look at the Americans' wildlife combating strategy, it's very integrated routes of traffic. It was done 2 years ago. So this is an international phenomenon where we're saying, hold on, not conservation, transnational organised crime, threat to national, regional and international security. Let's get the right people around the table. Let's start talking a different language. No more poaching, trafficking. And that is why we can assert a national security threat. Okay, so as a government, we got together end of last year, and we said, look, we need to, from the committee of inquiry, we need to establish how we can solve this. There's a paradigm shift required. So we got the right people around the table, including experts on trafficking, customs, law enforcement, organised crime, and this process was led by the police. And throughout this year, we got to a point where we developed a wildlife trafficking combating strategy. Integrated approach led by intelligence. I'm going to speak briefly to it. However, cannot go into too much detail as the strategy is currently in the highest level of our law enforcement, being final for approval. So I cannot go down to a tactical level, naturally, but I can give you a strategic overview of what is it that we're planning to do. However, I will admit that since we've developed this year at a national level, we've started implementing this approach, which I will share with you. Okay, so to combat wildlife trafficking, which is the entire value chain, in an organised manner, the South African government recognised the need for a whole-of-government approach assisted by civil society, okay, which is a very primary role play. And the development of the proposed national integrated strategy to combat wildlife trafficking, we in government refer to as the NISQUIT, so I'll call it that, is aimed to address this need. We kept it simple. There's three objectives, and three objectives only. First objective, we need to improve and enhance how we investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate wildlife trafficking as a form of transnational organised crime. Not a wildlife crime, not a conservation issue. Secondly, increasing the government's ability to detect, prevent, and combat. We need to start picking up where is this happening and stop it. Border posts, transport routes, but I'll speak a bit more to it. And then lastly, very important, as Julian mentioned, the wrong people and the wrong structures are engaging each other internationally, environment to environment. It should be law enforcement to law enforcement, intelligence to intelligence on this issue. So let's just quickly go through the three objectives. It has got an array of secondary objectives, and it's a very comprehensive and detailed document. But just in a nutshell, it speaks about improving crime intelligence, putting them in the front as a mandate, bringing intelligence together. There is at the moment way too many role players. And I think it's like that in a lot of other countries. Conservation is involved, law enforcement is involved, defense is involved, border management is involved. Then, who takes the lead? And it's very simple. This strategy talks about there's one department that takes the lead, and only one, the South African Police Service. It is an organised crime issue, and they are the mandated department. So it's call it SAPS, a SAPS-led strategy. How do we combat organised crime? We start improving our forensics. We start following the money. Where's the money being laundered? The intelligence gathering on the money. We start arresting and prosecuting corrupt officials, breaking that chain, etc. And then, very important also, is the law enforcement must reduce the gap between law enforcement and civil society, conservation, and private rhino owners. We found that there's sometimes, and it's not only in our country, a mistrust between it and an authority. Both are very prominent role players in this, but this issue is organised crime. It must be law enforcement led, but law enforcement cannot do it by themselves. Because civil society, conservation structures, they're sitting on a lot of information. They have feet and eyes on the ground where law enforcement can't always reach. So they are a primary role player that must be pulled in, and that relationship must be strengthened. And then detection. If a border official doesn't know to look for the difference, he or she won't. If a border official doesn't have technology and resources like dog detector units to find wildlife, they won't. You have to resource them. You have to give them the training, the skills, and this is what the strategy is. And it clearly outlines how we're going to do it. It doesn't say, let's do it. It says you need to take resources in the strategy and put them there, there, and there. You need to enhance training there, there, and there. Throughout the world, if you want to detect organised crime, it is impossible to just rely on customs and your border management, because we as governments cannot scan everything. It's impossible. If you look at it, you need intelligence to say which container, you need intelligence to say which yacht is being used. Very important. For example, recently picked up in South Africa abalone being smuggled in coffins. You can't just go and open every coffin that goes through your border post. You need to know which coffin. Very important. Could cause an issue. And then crime prevention in these areas. Again, local communities, for example, around the park, as an example. There's a lot of other issues of crime there, and if you increase your policing of those areas, it will have a ripple effect. Okay, and then lastly, international cooperation. A lot's being done already of it, but we are saying from a national security point of view, when we engage Asian countries, when we engage European countries, South American countries on this issue, we must send our head of our police, our head of our intelligence services, not our environmental affairs minister. They must support them in that engagement. You want law enforcement agreements, intelligence sharing agreements. That's what you want. It's organized crime. And then also, and why? Because you can catch them when they're here, but you struggle to catch them when they're not here. Okay. We are dependent on other countries' law enforcement and intelligence structures. So that bridge and that gap must be overcome. Okay, so basically, we need to move in my environment that I come from. We love this need-to-know principle. That's not going to get us anywhere. When the issue of wildlife trafficking, we need to start going on a need-to-share principle. So, in a nutshell, on the integrated approach, this is what we have proposed. The South African Police Service takes the lead, and all these different role players, departments, must support. They play all a very important role in the implementation of the proposed strategy. Okay, so what will the benefits be? Very simple. If you improve your law enforcement investigations and prosecutions and enhance it, if you improve your detection and prevention, if you improve your international collaboration and coordination, you'll improve your way you combat law enforcement. However, that's not the only spin-off. Because not only will you reduce wildlife trafficking, there will be other spin-offs to it, including increased state security, increased border management, reduction of corruption, increased community development, improved international standing, and then increased wildlife sustainability, etc. So to show you how we have already taken this approach forward, we've identified through analysing intelligence, analysing hotspots, etc., bringing it together, and we went and said, okay, where do we have resources? Because resources is always the issue. Let's take some of these resources and start targeting it in the places where we know it's really needed. So for example, our South African Revenue Service, the Customs Division, has a really a good dog detection unit. And that looks at wildlife. We got some of these dogs and we took them to the park, the Kruger Park. And immediately, we started seeing the results. Immediately. To such a degree, and I love this photo. That was a few people driving in, nice vehicle, very nicely dressed, not what you would say, this is the profile of what a poacher would look like. Our customs dogs picked it up. They let them go through almost like a controlled delivery, let the law enforcement and this integrated approach project with rangers, law enforcement, customs, pounced. So that's one of the ways. And even more, one of the biggest busts we had at our biggest airport. Again, it was customs. Why? They used the right resources at the right place, profiling, using intelligence, saying that's where we should look for horn. They used their resources, focused, and we have a result. Now this is one of our best examples of this integrated approach. Now this is what the strategy proposes, the picture on the right. When you investigate wildlife trafficking, it must be intelligence-driven and prosecution-led. So when you have a project, for example, the prosecutor must be there, the intelligence department or whatever sector, crime intelligence, law enforcement investigation, in our case it's the Hawks, and when you pounce and you arrest, this case over here, they arrested the poachers, the foreign national buyers, the corrupt officials, all in one day. They knew all that they were, and to add insult to injury, they took all their assets the same day. So this is what we're proposing going forward. As a conclusion, the Rhino issue showed how a conservation issue can become very quickly securitized into a national security issue if you allow it, if you don't focus on it correctly, on how to combat it. It's however seen as the beginning of a larger security issue. We have already seen in this country in the last few months how elephants are starting to increasingly be poached and other issues. And there's a clear need to improve communication and coordination between relevant law enforcement agencies across the world, internationally. So I have one recommendation, and if we do not follow a whole of government approach and society approach, we will not be able to effectively and comprehensively combat wildlife trafficking in South Africa. It's therefore recommended that all role players in the conservation environment, including civil society, both domestic and internationally, should support the South African government, especially the South African Police Service, regarding its proposed paradigm shift in the way it combats wildlife trafficking, which includes the police's current endeavours in finalising and implementing the NISPIT. Thank you very much.